That picture was drawn by a Dutch visitor to London. He was a visitor to Queen Elizabeth's court at about the time that Shakespeare was living, and it is considered the most accurate representation of London known to exist from the time of Shakespeare. All right, moving right along. Why is this not?
It was drawn by a Dutch dude.
Yeah, don't worry about that. Why is this not advancing? Woo! Oh. Seriously, why is it going so fast? There we go. Shakespeare was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, supposedly on April 23rd. The city is called Stratford, the town is Stratford, and the Avon is a river, but the town is known as Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, in Shakespeare's day, they did not keep birth records. Governments did not keep birth records, but they did keep baptismal records. And Shakespeare there is a birth record, a baptismal record for Shakespeare that is on, I think it's April 25th. Why do you suppose they didn't keep birth records? Why didn't they keep birth records? Anyone? Henry? No? Yes.
They weren't in hospitals?
No, it has nothing to do with hospitals. Jacob?
So many of them, they can keep like track of them?
Nope. No, it's because not most, but infant mortality was extremely high. A lot of babies died. So the government didn't bother keeping birth records. The churches who kept the baptismal records did keep track of all babies. And typically a baby was baptized within a couple days of being born, again, because of the high infant mortality rate. So scholars backdate his birth a couple of days, and you're going to see why in a second. He was married to Anne Hathaway, not that one. Not the one who's in the movies right now. She was 8 years older than Shakespeare, which was a significant number back in Shakespeare's day. There are some people who argue that Shakespeare got married at the end of a shotgun, which means what? He was forced to marry Anne Hathaway because she was already pregnant. Nobody knows that for sure, but that's one of the legends around Shakespeare. They had 3 children. The oldest was named Susanna, Susanna, and she eventually married a man named Dr. John Hall, who at one point in his life got in trouble with the law for treating Catholics. John Hall. His other 2 children were Judith and Hamnet, not Hamlet, Hamnet. And Catholics, yeah. Hamnet was 8 years old when he passed away. And it's interesting if you read Shakespeare's literature at about that time, you can see a turn in his writing that suggested he was grieving the loss of his son. Yes?
What were the other 2?
Judith and Hamnet.
What's the first one called?
Susanna. Shakespeare has, currently living in this world today, 0 blood descendants. So none of his children prospered enough to have heirs. Now, around 1588, Shakespeare moved to London. We don't know for sure. That's why it has a question mark next to it. We don't know for sure because they didn't, there's no record of Shakespeare saying, I'm moving to London tomorrow, and it's 1588. It's just that his name starts appearing in the public records in London around 1588. Similarly, scholars believed he moved back to Stratford in 1610 because his name starts appearing in the public records in Stratford around that time. Now, the whole time Shakespeare was in London, his family remained in Stratford. So his entire professional career, he lived apart from his family. So what is that, 22 years? So, and a lot of people have speculated about the quality of the marriage and that sort of thing, but of course we don't know any of that. Very, very little is known about Shakespeare the man. But we do know he moved back to live with his family We know that he bought the biggest house in Stratford, the most expensive one. We know he died a rich man, which was unusual for an actor at the time. Actors, stage people, theater folk were generally living play to play. Shakespeare was an exception. He died a very rich man. And if you go to Stratford, you can tour his house to this day. And then in 1616, the bard died in Stratford on April 23rd. Moment of silence, please. Thank you. We know for a fact that he died on April 23rd. There are records that prove it. And so why did they post-date his birth date to April 23rd? For the sake of convenience. To say that he was both born and died on the same day. Questions so far? Okay, moving along. Okay, Shakespeare in London. Once he moved to London, he went there as an actor, and he struggled, as a lot of young burgeoning actors do and did. But by 1592, he started to gain some prominence in London because he wrote 2 very salacious poems, very naughty poems. And when you take the Shakespeare class, I'll tell you the names of those poems. So those were very, very popular. They got passed around. Shakespeare started making a name for himself. And just about that time, 1592 to 1593, the theaters closed. So whatever momentum he had going kind of got the brakes put on it. Why were the theaters closed in that year? Anybody know? Stephen? Black and white films? There was no such thing as film in this time. Yeah, moving pictures were not invented until, I want to say, the late 1800s, very late, or early 1900s. Pratik?
There is the war.
Nope, no war. Yes.
Plague.
It was the plague, an outbreak of the bubonic plague. So the city fathers in London, these are the aldermen and the Lord Mayor, those people, really hated the theaters. They thought it brought the wrong type of people to town, namely actors. Actors were people who kind of opted out of the regularly structured, ordered society and moved around. And the city fathers, they moved around from place to place, and that made people really nervous back in the early modern era. And so the city fathers were always looking for any excuse they could come up with to close the theaters. And along came this very, very unfortunate reason. Now, it made sense not to have people in close proximity during the plague. But it was convenient for the city fathers who wanted them closed anyway. Around 1594, Shakespeare became a part of a company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. And at this time, if you didn't have a prominent patron, if you were a theater company, if you didn't have a prominent patron, you probably weren't going to survive terribly long. The Lord Chamberlain was the highest ranking official in Queen Elizabeth's in the court of England, whether it was a king or whether it was a queen. And you could an equivalent in our government would be like the presidential chief of staff. This is an enormously powerful, influential person. Now, historically, a chamberlain was just a servant who was in charge of a bedroom. And the Lord Chamberlain was the servant in charge of the king's bedroom. And rarely did England have queens until the middle of the 1500s. So it was the servant in charge of the king's or the queen's bedroom. If you were the king or the queen, who would you appoint to be your Lord Chamberlain?
The best servant.
The best servant? Okay, sure, maybe. The most loyal, the most trustworthy. Why, Talas? Because you're sleeping in that bedroom. Yeah, drug you, do something terrible to you. Yeah, because if you want somebody you trust because you're sleeping in the next room. Similarly, there was a lot of comings and goings from king's bedrooms. And you wanted somebody who would be discreet. Yes?
What did you say the definition of it was?
At the time that Shakespeare lived, the Lord Chamberlain had ceased to be this servant of the bedroom and had become a public figure within the court, a very powerful politician, equivalent to the American presidency's chief of staff. Sure. So the fact that they had this powerful figure as their patron gives you an indication of how well thought of this company was. And now in 1599, the Globe Theatre was built south of the Thames River in Southwark. Southwark was the Wild West in Shakespeare's day. It was outside the traditional walls of London. It was outside the purview of the city fathers. They couldn't do anything about it. Interestingly enough, most of the land south of the river was owned by a bishop, by the Bishop of Winchester. But I won't quiz you on that. And there's a legend surrounding the move of the Globe Theatre. So if you look up there, right there, you've got a student rendering of the Globe Theatre, and that's actually pretty good. It's a massive structure, and they've rebuilt the Globe Theatre within a couple hundred yards of where the original Globe Theatre was. When I was studying in London, the archaeologists who had been excavating south of the river found the original footings of the original Globe Theatre. And it was a huge discovery at the time. And now they're doing all kinds of excavations there. But a couple hundred yards away is the new Globe Theatre, and it's right on the Thames. And it's a magnificent, magnificent place. And so the legend has it that on Christmas Eve night in 1599, Shakespeare and his company dismantled the Globe, and the Thames River froze over. They slid the timbers of the river over the river to get them to the other side, and they rebuilt the Globe. Does that pass the smell test?
Yes.
It does? That sounds logical and reasonable that happened?
They have to have a big company. A lot of guys. Well, probably not.
Yeah, maybe there's 30 or 40 men in the company.
Did they just make the Globe and Mouse?
How big was it?
It's a massive building.
It's like
There's no way they could disassemble it in winter and then slide it over.
No, not the size of Marquette, probably, but easily the size of the gym.
Oh,
So in one night,
maybe.
they're going to disassemble an entire building. They're going to slide the timbers over the river, and they're going to rebuild it. I mean, it's just illogical.
Maybe.
And it also doesn't pass the smell test because Christmas Eve night, it's just such a quaint little story. The reality is, in Shakespeare's day, it cost money to take anything over a bridge. And so what they likely did, the Thames rarely freezes in London. It does, but it rarely freezes, and it might not have frozen enough to slide all these timbers. If you see the Globe ever, and I'll show you a picture of it later, there's no way it could have been taken down in one night. There's no way. Most likely, they took the timbers over on barges in order to avoid the tax that you had to pay by taking it across bridges. This probably happened over the course of several months. But it's one of those legends that surround Shakespeare. Yeah.
I thought the Globe Theatre burnt down.
Oh, it did. The second one. Yeah. Now, in 1600, we had the first known performance of The Merchant of Venice. And that was in the Globe on the south side of the river. In 1603, King James ascended to the throne, took over after Elizabeth died, and formed a company called the King's Men, and took over patronage of Shakespeare's company. So the Lord Chamberlain went with another group, and King James took over patronage of Shakespeare's company, which gives you an indication of how prominent their company was. The King of England was their patron. Yeah. Take the Shakespeare class, we'll talk about that. All right. Early acting companies. What's a company, first of all? What's the word company? How many of your parents work for companies? Probably most of them. Some of them might own their own. But a company is a group of people working together to produce a product or a service and hopefully to make a profit from it. Yes? Yeah. Well, that's what an acting company is. What's their product? Plays. No such thing as movies at the time, boys. Yeah. Plays. So the product was plays. There were 6 jobs you could have in an early modern acting company. The first one was called a sharer. It is the same sort of thing that a shareholder today is. So what is a shareholder in today's companies? If you're a shareholder in something, Stephen?
You put in
Yeah, you put in money, which gives you a partial ownership of the company, and then hopefully